Now you should be able to hear. Okay, apologies. There was another little step in the procedure which was kind of skipping. Okay, by next week, I'm sure I will have managed to remember all the small details which we have to remember when delivering a hybrid lecture. Now, two small announcements / clarifications. As I have anticipated yesterday, our guest lecture number 2, you maybe noticed that in the syllabus there was an open slot for that, will be Jonathan Levy, who from the University of Chicago. Jonathan is visiting Bocconi in this term. I talked to him this morning, and he's happy to deliver to this class a lecture on American capitalism in a global perspective. He's an expert on the history of American capitalism. He lectures in global economic history at Chicago. I think in the second half of the course, he will be able to deliver a very interesting lecture, and by then, we will have kind of reached the period historically on which Jonathan tends to focus his own research. So I am discussing with him the exact date. As soon as I have that, I will update the syllabus and let you know in class. But basically, this is just an organization issue between him and us. This doesn't change anything else. The other thing is the following. I didn't tell you yesterday that usually what I do when I deliver a hybrid lecture, as we have the problem of the Blackboard, which I'm sure it's difficult to read from home, at the end of the lecture, I will take a picture with my mobile phone of the board, and will update that as soon as I can in the Blackboard space together with the slides of the relevant lecture, right? Which might come in handy also for the others who will find a collection of these pictures. Sometimes what I write on the Blackboard is a little bit more detailed. In other instances, it's going simply to be like, maybe a small graph or whatever. And based on previous experience, this seems to work decently well. And it works notably better than more high-tech solutions, which, as you know, tend to lead to problems. One of these problems, which we encountered, is that we will be unable, unfortunately, to show videos in class for the reason that the audio would not be heard from home. So for this course, we had developed a few years ago a range of short videos with actually animations, which like explore sometimes parts of history which we do not cover otherwise with reading material. For example, the arrival of the Portuguese in Japan. These videos will be uploaded together with the other material for the relevant lecture. There is one video uploaded together with the material for lecture number 2, but we will not show them in class because this would mean cutting out of the class the people at home, okay, because of the audio problem. So as we did last year, also this year, based on the platform we have, I came to the conclusion that the best thing is that you look at them on your own. That's a pity. We continue to live in complex times. Okay, these are very short videos, a few minutes each, and there will be maybe 5 for the wall of the course. And I will, of course, tell you something about the contents in class about that. Okay, and I think that's it. If you have questions about practicalities, the exam, whatever, which you want to ask me, you could ask them now. So after we begin with the topic of today's lectures, is everything clear what I discussed in class yesterday? Okay. I trust, well, other practical thing. Please record your attendance, both the students in class and those connected from home, which is something that we are required to do, also to kind of have statistics about the occupation, physical occupation of the rooms and the saturation of the connections, whatever. Okay. So if there are no questions, and be aware of the fact that for each specific item in the evaluation, we will have a moment when I will kind of provide you much more information, including, as we were discussing yesterday, about the structure of the written exam, which is a pretty simple structure, which has become, over the years, my kind of standard for a course like this one. So, again, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions at any point during my class. People from home can ask questions by writing them in the chat. Now, today, the idea is to cover a pretty ancient period in human history, or if you want, even prehistory, if you define that as a moment before the beginning of written sources, because according to some interpretations, a crucial moment of the early divergence between broad world areas is connected to the so-called Neolithic revolution of the Stone Age, which took place about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, and basically is the moment when human beings, who up until the moment in time were organized as bands of hunters-gatherers, so basically they lived off the land of what they could hunt or collect from nature, so the natural products from wild plants. Well, they start herding animals and cultivating the land, and they also start becoming sedentary, so they start building the first permanent villages. And this is, in many respects, a crucial moment in human history, because this leads to a range of accelerated changes. Accelerated, meaning quicker changes, quicker compared to what? Compared to what existed before, right? For example, from this moment, as we will see, there is a significant increase in the speed of demographic growth. So human populations start growing at a much quicker pace. That pace is glacially slow compared to what we know today, but it's much quicker than everything which existed before. Now, this transition seems to have started independently and basically in an autonomous way in different parts of the world, in the Near East, in the so-called Fertile Crescent, in the area between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, as well as in China, in Central America, and maybe in some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa as well. Although for Sub-Saharan Africa and maybe also for certain parts of North America, we have some greater incertitude, and what it seems is that this transition, if it happened autonomously, happened anyway at a little bit later point in time. This area then start this process on their own, as far as we know, surely the areas which go through this first, which is interesting because this suggests that people residing in those areas were all subject to the same stimuli. So there are some causes triggering this crucial transformation, which probably were common across the areas. But many other areas profit from the innovations introduced in these original areas because, for example, agriculture is transferred from an area to the other, which basically means moving across the land the seeds of domesticated plants or bringing domesticated animals to areas where they were not originally domesticated, or even where they were not present as wild species. Okay? And this is the case, for example, for Europe. In Europe, agriculture did not develop spontaneously. It was introduced from the Middle East, basically, and then when it is introduced, it starts developing its own path locally. Now, when we say that there are areas which go through a transition first, you might think that the timing of this transition is possibly relevant for explaining tendencies, right? This seems to be the case, especially when comparing Eurasia with the Americas. And however, this is something that we know does not explain everything, because, for example, the Middle East introduced agriculture before Europe, but in the long run, Europe comes up on top in terms of levels of development, at least from the late Middle Ages on. So, as we will discuss later in the class, it's not like geography is everything. But at the same time, there are constraints which are dependent on geography, in the sense that they are dependent on where these phases of transition begin, because the availability of domesticable species was not even across the planet. Now, if we look at where the original wild species are placed, we get a situation in which different areas where we know agriculture was introduced spontaneously, so autonomously, or probably autonomously, say, had access to different species, in terms, in this case, of vegetables. And if we look at the main crops, however, we immediately come to an interesting conclusion, because if you compare Eurasia, where you have wheat and rice, which are among the most important cereals to this day, to the Americas, where the main crops were, in the end, maize and potato, well, you immediately notice, if you know a bit about the characteristics in nutritional terms of these vegetables, that the Eurasian wild species, or, well, these are in fact the domesticated species, but the Eurasian, the species which are original from Eurasia are superior to those which are original from the Americas. Superior in terms, for example, of the caloric intake, and in general of the nutrients that they can provide to human beings. And as we will see, this disadvantage which the Americas suffered from is even more clear if we look at the domesticable species of animals. But before that, we need to think about what it means to domesticate a vegetable species. What do you think it means to domesticate a plant? Yeah, you select for the harvest, but what, I mean, which characteristics do you want?
Which harvest do you need the best seed planted and then do that?
Okay. Yeah. So your colleague, for the students at home, your colleague says you select at each harvest the seeds which have the best characteristics, which led to the plants with best characteristics, which you want to reproduce. But the question is, which are the best characteristics? Yeah, but what you might think is desirable?
Color, size.
Color, well, size, and so your colleague also mentioned size, but say in general, the amount of fruit which the plant produces is relevant. So you want a plant which is able to produce more for you, right? And size is part of the story. In many fruit trees, that's exactly what happens, for example. So you come from smaller fruit to larger fruits. In other cases, like, for example, the case of cereals, it's more a matter of how many seeds you have on the same stem. You want to tell something? Right. All right, your colleague mentions the issue of how well the species survives the weather, which has, in fact, a number of possible meanings. So one issue is that of adapting a species which is original from a certain climate area, say, to grow also in another climate area. That's more a matter of exporting to different areas species which originate from a slightly different environment. Another issue, however, is that, for example, you want, when you domesticate cereals, you want plants which do not drop the seed when they experience strong winds. And in the case of cereals, that's the second fundamental thing. So one issue is how many seeds you have, or if you want, which is the percentage of the biomass of the plant, which is seed, which is what, of course, human beings can use, right? And the second issue is with the rachis. The rachis is the part of the cereal, the stem of the cereal, which, well, again, for reasons which I can't understand, the slide is being shown with an extremely small character, which is bizarre because this is not how I plotted that. I think it's again a conversion issue with the platform. Sorry. So you will be able to find a readable version of that in the Blackboard space. Yeah, but this should be the PDF. I wanted to share the PDF at least. Oh, you are right. I did a mistake. Okay. Okay, I will stop sharing this and share the other one because I have uploaded both the. Oh, okay. No, yeah, I did a more substantial mistake. So. Okay, just wait a moment because I have, in fact. Sorry, I had intended to do this, but I, by mistake, downloaded the wrong version. Okay, no, it's another mistake here, because I need to download. Okay. Now, if this is correct, grr. GDI less2, why it doesn't appear? Ah, because it changed. Oh, okay, okay, now I get it. In the conversion, in the download, for bizarre reasons, it changed the name of the file. So it's 161, whatever. Almost there. In the meantime, I will do this. Okay, now this is how it was supposed to look. Fantastic. Thank you for the tip. Now, so the point is, a wild plant will produce, especially a wild version of cereal, like the einkorn, which is the ancestor of wheat, original from Anatolia. produces a certain amount of seed on a relatively long stem, and the part of the stem which carries the seed is called the rachis, and the rachis is brittle because what does the plant want to do? It wants to disperse the seed. So if you have a nice strong wind, the plant wants to break the rachis, disperse the seed across a large area, which of course is not what you as a farmer want, because you will never be able to collect the seed then. So what you want is, yes, a plant which carries more seed by unit of biomass, which basically means a plant which invests more of its energy into producing seed than into producing the stem, or in general the not edible, not comestible part of the plant, what you can't eat. So more seed, but also a shorter plant and a less brittle rachis, because a shorter plant means less energy spent in producing the stem, and also less susceptibility to wind or other meteorological conditions which might lead the seed to drop, and at the same time, a less brittle rachis for the same purpose, basically. And this, of course, can take a shorter or longer time to move from this situation to this situation, depending on the characteristics of the wild species. So wheat and rice, the wild variant, the wild ancestors of domesticated wheat and rice were relatively similar to the domesticated plant. So it was easier to domesticate them. In the case of maize, which I will show you shortly, it was much more difficult, because if you look at what is probably the wild ancestor of maize, the so-called teosinte, which is a currently existing wild plant in the Americas, it's very different from how cultivated maize looks today. So this means that you need more time to domesticate it, and on top of that, when you accomplish this process, you will still have a crop which is, from the nutritional point of view, not as good as wheat. So this is a disadvantage which was experienced in this case by the Central and Southern American populations, which made it more difficult for them to increase the amount of calories production per hectare in a way as efficient as that which was possible in the Middle East to the people who settled that area and found the wild variants, the wild ancestors of wheat growing spontaneously in Anatolia and around that. Okay? And this, as we will see, is one possible origin of this difference. Now, that's about the original agriculture, the original areas of domestication. If we move into the issue of the spread of agriculture, you have here, for example, a map which, based on archaeology, suggests how the agriculture introduced first in, again, the Near East was introduced into Europe. In this case, introducing agriculture means bringing the domesticated seeds, okay? So bringing wheat to Italy, Spain, France, areas where it could be cultivated, but it was not original, was not an original plant of the area. In some cases, there was maybe the original plant, but it was much more efficient to introduce directly the domesticated plant. In some cases that happened, but in general, the point is the domesticated species appears first in relatively small areas where, as it happens, it was largely available as a wild species from before domestication, which, if you think about that, is a very simple reasoning. Now, if you look at a more recent study done on the spread of agriculture, now you might find it difficult to read this map in class because the dots are pretty small, but if you can get an impression of the colors. The black places are those of original domestication. In this case, what this map charters is where archaeologically we have evidence of the existence of agriculture from a certain period on. So black is the earliest period, and then you move into gray and then white, which is the more recent period. So you see basically what I was showing you before, right? Movement from the Middle East towards the northwest of Europe, with the south of Europe being reached first, as in a wave-like spread, as you can see here. Now, in this specific study by Olson and Pike, what is interesting, however, is that they also have, they also provide an interpretation of what it means in practice introducing agriculture first. And they argue that, true, if you look at broad areas, like, for example, the Euro-Mediterranean area versus, this area, but also including, of course, the Fertile Crescent, so the wall of the Middle East, versus the Americas, starting first, this process is an advantage. And this is basically what Diamond says. I mentioned Diamond because now I will show you quite a few slides based on his work. And as you know, you have 3 chapters from his book to cover for this course. By the way, as I told you yesterday, we have required those chapters required to you electronically through the Blackboard, basically. But I don't know whether they've already done that. So if you haven't access to them already, you will very soon. We are kind of pushing the library to do this. Usually they are very reactive, so it's a matter of days, unless the problem has already been solved. And there are copies of the book by Diamond in the library anyway, if you want to check that. However, what's interesting here is that these authors also highlight something which, of course, we knew, but they kind of provide a more refined statistical measurement of this other additional fact, which is that internally, so internally to each macro area, it's not true that the areas where agriculture was introduced first experience a long-run advantage, right? If you think at this area, so at Europe plus the Middle East, the advantage in the long run is in Europe, right? So it's a kind of reversal, which might be due to a bunch of other things, of course, but the point here, to me, is that this is further confirmation of the fact that in this story, geography is very important, but it's not the only factor, right? When you read Diamond in particular, you get the impression in the end that he kind of falls a bit into the trap of geographic determinism. So in his book, almost everything is about geography, geographic advantages, and then, geographical features of the land, climate belts, the existence of choke points in between land masses, which kind of influence the spread of human beings, and so forth and so on. And as we will see, even the divergence within Eurasia between Europe and East Asia, for him, can be explained basically with geographical features of these areas, which I don't think is particularly convincing. I'm much more convinced by his arguments about the original divergence between Eurasia as a whole and the Americas and about this. Okay. Anyway, in this other article, you find these other layers. So geography is not everything, even if you look just at data about the introduction of agriculture. Now, I would also like to tell you something about archaeology, which is this. Now, archaeology, in some segments of history, is today basically the source of virtually all the new data which we have. So if you think at the period which goes from prehistory till the Bronze Age, so the Bronze Age, which begins about 5 or 6,000 years ago, the real advancement in knowledge today comes from archaeological data. Even for later periods in certain world areas, and this is definitely the case for sub-Saharan Africa, so all those areas and periods in the end for which you don't have written sources, or you don't have any more written sources to discover, which includes, for example, Egypt, right? So for Egypt, probably we have all the written sources, almost all the written sources that we will ever have. This based on what Walter Scheidel, told to students at this university a few years ago. For example, Walter Scheidel is a great expert in ancient societies. He's the author of a very important book on long-run inequality tendency. I will mention that later, but he's really an expert in the history of ancient Mediterranean societies, basically. So the point is, there is little which we can expect to appear in terms of, written sources about Egypt. Yeah, maybe deep in the desert of Egypt, we will find a more or less preserved papyrus, which will give us some additional information. But in general, even for Egypt, which is the Egyptian society is one for which we have a lot of written information, the new stuff today tends to come mostly from archaeology. This is even more true, again, for example, ancient kingdoms in sub-Saharan Africa, where written data is extremely, extremely, extremely limited. So this is relatively new, and this means that if you look at studies of, say, the pre-industrial, sorry, the Neolithic period, or the Bronze Age, if you think, for example, of the story of the Phoenicians, the big people of traders or the Mediterranean, their story is changing year after year. So it's dramatically changing, because archaeology, and including specific sectors of archaeology like maritime archaeology, which basically means going and find the remnants of shipwrecks from the Bronze Age on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, right? Or archaeology in sub-Saharan Africa, are fields which have been booming in the last 15 or 20 years, so it's pretty recent. So for all these areas, what we know changes continuously and very quickly. And this is very important in the case of Africa in particular, and not only. Anyway, so these studies, this kind of studies, makes full use of this new kind of information, which is becoming increasingly available. And it confirms, but also adds additional twists to these kind of general reconstructions of the spread of agriculture. This for the Middle East and Europe and the Mediterranean, and this instead for East Asia. Similar story, archaeological evidence, again, original areas of domestication of wild species, rice, for example, and then spread of these species across much broader areas. Sometimes this means, as your colleague rightly hinted at, domesticating the species in the sense of making it able to grow also in environmental conditions which are slightly different from the original ones. Now, let me tell you a story, which is this. This is prehistory, so there is only so much we can understand about what they did in practice, right? But we know much more about the domestication of American species to cultivation in Europe. So when the Europeans get into the Americas from 1492 on, so when Columbus arrives to the island of Hispaniola, and they start bringing back vegetables which were present there, and especially the potato and maize, or corn in American English. So I'll call it maize because corn is it can lead to misunderstandings because apparently in England, I don't know. The word is used differently in British English and in American English, for example. And even in British English, corn is like grano in Italian. So grano in Italian doesn't mean anything because it has to do with the physical shape of what you're talking about, right? The right word for wheat in Italian is not grano, it's frumento, which is the species. Just because I suppose this might be not, maybe not common knowledge because we use some certain words very commonly, like pasta di grano duro, well, it's frumento is the origin of that. And corn is the same. So I will call maize, right? In American English, usually it is referred to as corn. Anyway, when they are brought into Europe, well, we know very well that the original area where they were domesticated is Galicia, which is the northwestern region of Spain, right? And we know, we have written sources about what they do year after year. So basically what they do is to bring in a ton of varieties of potatoes and of maize. We didn't think about including a picture of that, but we have drawings from the early 16th century. And when you look at the kind of potatoes which they were trying to cultivate in northwestern Spain, they look totally different from a potato as you know today in Europe. They're different things. And on top of that, they were many. So there were many potatoes being brought to Europe and many different variants of maize. And they start experimenting, like, they take hills, whole hills, and they plant year after year the plant at different elevations. And they try different conditions of humidity, pretty scientifically if you want, right? Pre-scientific method, but you can read these from the perspective of making a scientific experiment. And then what gets into the rest of Europe is the very few variants of those crops which are found to grow decently well in the European condition, right? And they change, of course, a bit, because when you continue this process of domestication, you select for characteristics which are relevant to you, maybe in terms of, I don't know, size of the fruit or taste even, but also characteristics which work particularly well in the different environmental conditions of Europe, because the plant is not original from Europe. And it's that variant which then is spread across broader areas. Now, interestingly, and this is relevant to our story, if you think about maize, maize spreads in Europe in a very specific climate belt, which runs from Galicia, so northwestern Spain, through all of North Spain, South France, and North Italy. Not to the north of this area, nor to the south of this area. So maize requires specific conditions of humidity. In other areas, especially in North Europe, they bring the potato. Why the potato? Because they can't bring maize, which is preferred in the 16th century. And then there will be a lot of things to say about this story, which would tap into how societies react culturally to introduction of new crops, but we don't have the time for doing that, right? But remember this thing about the climate belt. So maize, in its spread in Europe, moves strictly west to east from its point of introduction to the west, and the point of introduction to the west is there because the harbors where the plant came in from the America were all of them on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, and spread straight to the east within a relatively small band, because if you move up or down, you change climate belt. And that's bad for maize. It's not very adaptable from that point of view. Climate belt, but in this case, the crucial factor is humidity. And this is, as we will see, one of the factors mentioned by Diamond as being crucially important. Now, let's go back to the issue of domestication. So geography is not the only thing, right? Even looking only at factors like the date of introduction of agriculture. And still, from a broad perspective, it's relevant, the fact that agriculture is introduced in the Americas later than in Eurasia or sub-Saharan Africa, but especially later than Eurasia. And Eurasia, I will use a lot the term Eurasia because when we look at this period, there is something in common. I mean, there is something which at least certain parts of this enormous landmass, which I call Eurasia, have in common. Right? One thing they have in common is being the first to domesticate wild species and having basically the best wild species available globally for domestication. So the late introduction of agriculture in the Americas, however, is itself dependent on another factor, as we will see, which is the relatively late arrival of human beings there. Before going there, however, let me ask you first this question. Who took my class in economic history at the undergrad level? You did? Only you? Okay. So you can't answer to this question. Okay. What do you think it means that in the Neolithic there is what we call an agricultural revolution? Meaning, why do they introduce agriculture? Also people from home can answer, of course. So we know from archaeology that they introduced agriculture in the Middle East and in East Asia more or less at the same time. Why? Why do they do that? You and then you, or whatever, or
Maybe it was due to the domestication of animals also, because I think that if at the later stage of human development, they were mainly focused on hunting or finding plants that were not domesticated plants. Then also the fact that the agricultural development rate at the time was also probably due to the fact that also animals became more and more important in society as a whole, and so they changed, let's say, from hunting them to use them for agricultural.
So your colleague argues that this may be due to a connection between hunting and industrial agriculture because first, then, I think if I understand correctly what you said, first they domesticate animals which they had been hunting before, and then somehow they realize that they can kind of settle and also, okay. Not really, because the domestication of animals starts, as far as we know, but again, consider that as the data is archaeological, it's not like you can pinpoint this to a specific year, but generally speaking, the two processes start together. Yeah, but they introduce agriculture and they settle. So it's again, it's not like they settle, they do that at the same time. Also because if you want to plant, you have to stop moving along, yes. But they do that again at the same time. So, yes. Okay. So your colleague in class is referring to an ideological shift from being hunter-gatherers to producing their own stuff. But then the question remains, so why do they do that? Why there is this ideological shift? Like, you have the emergence of a reformer who says, you know what? I had this great idea, which nobody ever had. We can plant, or we can, take the seed and plant it and get more. Okay, so your colleague in class argues, again, students at home can make hypotheses, writing them in the chat. Your student argues that they change from hunting gathering to cultivating because it's easier and maybe less risky because, of course, you aren't chased back by, I don't know. You know what to get. Okay. So Diletta says they develop the technology necessary to make agriculture better. Okay. So this is basically suggesting that somebody comes up with an idea about how to cultivate, and then this proves effective, you produce food, and the idea spreads, right? And this is the idea behind one of the theories about this. It's exactly that. Somebody comes up with the idea that you can farm, so you basically have the discovery of agriculture. This is the So we cancel this, but this is only the announcement about who will deliver our second guest lecture. So you have, for taking one author as the reference, you have Child, who argued that the agricultural revolution was triggered by the discovery of agriculture. Okay, definitely, this is one hypothesis. Does anybody think that there might be problems with this idea, that agriculture is really discovered in the sense that somebody thinks, we can do that, and then everything changes?
Agriculture takes time to do it, so one may say that if I don't see the effect immediately, I give up.
Okay. Okay, agriculture takes, this is an interesting point. So you say, so the student in class said, agriculture takes time, so if you don't see the effects immediately, you stop doing that. You think even in the short run. Okay, let's expand this a bit. The point is the following. If the land is producing a lot of fruit and you are few, why should you do the effort? Should you do the effort in the end, right? I mean, it takes effort to do that, but you can collect the same amount or even more from the land. You had something to... Yeah. So your colleague argues that there are a lot of things that after the idea you have to develop, because agriculture is a bunch of things, right? A bunch of techniques, practices, tools. Absolutely. But still, we are thinking about the original point. So, this is a process, as domestication is by definition a process, because it's not like you move from the wild to a domesticated species in one cycle of production. You need more. Every time you select the seeds which characteristics you want, and a long time you converge towards the domesticated version, which ends up being what you, after a certain moment, you think you can't improve even further. And by the way, the domestication of species in this sense continued into the 20th century, so-called Green Revolution, which was meant to produce variants of key crops, like, for example, rice, more productive, was meant to do exactly that. Now we are close to what we think is the biological maximum we can obtain from certain crops, right? Also because if you move even further in certain directions, you encounter problems, like, for example, the amount of water you need to cultivate. So, what's efficient is not necessarily the strictly maximizing seed variant. You also want it to be able to grow with not that much water, to be resistant to parasites, and so forth and so on. Anyway, close parentheses. But again, there is a very important additional wave of domestication as late as the 1950s and 1960s, and then it continues even today. There is a continuous process of selection of better crops done in all countries, basically, right? The Green Revolution was a particularly intensive effort, which produced particularly impressive results. It is one of the reasons why what many feared back in the 1960s, which is the world moving towards a period of mass starvation because population was growing too quickly, never happened. Again, close parentheses, sorry. Yes, sorry if I made you wait. But you have to speak loudly. Right. So your colleague in class suggests that she doesn't get why viscous agriculture is a solution to the problem of how the agricultural revolution started, and suggested instead that maybe population growth is what led to the change. Now, to the first part of your point, I would answer, no, it is a solution, because at least on principle you could imagine that somebody, a genius of the Neolithic, has this idea, and then, of course, this is just the initial phase, and he and his descendants continue introducing new tools, techniques, and whatever, and you have the beginning of a process. But the other part of your point is actually spot on, because one possibility is that it was population pressure on the available resources which induced people to start herding animals and cultivating the land. Before getting into that, you wanted to add something? Okay, so you say the possibility that a comparable genius with the same idea appears in different parts of the world is not altogether impossible, but it doesn't seem very, very realistic. Yes, maybe, although we aren't talking about big numbers, maybe 2 or 3 areas. So, what I sometimes say, if you think about the dispersion of error along a Gaussian distribution, you can read this in 2 ways. People usually focus on the fact that, usually you are in the middle, but somebody must be in the tail. Maybe we are the universe in which we were in the tail, and the same genius appears, well, not the same, but 2 genius of like minds and intentions and whatever appear at the same time, even the same day, in 2 entirely different parts of the world. Absolutely, which only makes this even less likely. Yeah, but in fact, I don't think that this is the solution, because I am a relatively strong believer in the alternative explanation by Cohen. Now, the point is the following. In the alternative explanation, population pressure on resources forces people to cultivate or herd. Now, first think about this. You have hunter-gatherers living in the land and off the land. They live by collecting what the land produces spontaneously, right? They live all their lives in close contact with nature. Is it possible that they don't realize that if you, take a seed from an apple and plant it in the land, a new apple tree grows from that? I mean, the point is they observe this all the time. All the time. There are trees which have big seeds. You see the sprout directly from the seed. All the time, if you walk in the spring in a wood or a forest, you see that. So is it possible that this is knowledge I didn't have as somebody discovers that? As it is so easy to observe it. But then the problem becomes the effort, maybe. If I want to produce more apple trees, I have to plant them. But if I have a land in which there are plenty of apple trees or whatever other, edible, vegetable, whatever you want, why should I make the effort? Maybe somebody did the effort for the sake of Neolithic experimentation, but there wasn't the motivation to do this systematically. Was maybe the motivation? Population pressure on resources. So, before the introduction of agriculture, the population of human beings on planet Earth was growing, very slowly, but it was growing. So the point is, you reach a moment when the fruit of the land, including the animals that you can hunt and eat, are no longer sufficient to feed the population existing, living on that land. And then you have to do the extra effort if you want to feed your children, right? And when you do that, what happens is that people start growing at an even quicker pace. And this we know from archaeology. So there is something which we know. So we know that in a certain moment in time, people start doing three things together: cultivate the land, herd animals, and build villages. And we also know, again, based on archaeology, but the data is pretty consistent, so this is a strong finding, very reliable, that after that moment, population growth of the rate of growth of human population becomes much quicker than anything found before, which means that you end up in a process which is self-reinforcing, because you have even more people than before, and an even greater need to forcing the land to produce more fruit, because you need to feed more people, and on, and on, and on, and on, and on, and on, not necessarily improving, by the way, the life of human beings. So effort is one part of the story. You have to work. You have to work, right? Now, if I asked you this question, who works more? A hunter-gatherer or an early farmer? Easy question. I already told you the answer. So who votes for the hunter-gatherer as a hard worker? Who votes for the farmer? Well, very few people. Okay. Now let me ask you a tougher question. Who works more? Us in modern societies, or a farmer of the pre-industrial times, whatever period you want? Who works more? Maybe. So one colleague in class says now. I want you to declare. So who says, us, we work more, or the farmers, or the pre-industrial period? So who says we? Who says the farmers, the pre-industrial period? You and you. Okay. And you also. People at home don't want to risk getting a question. Now, the problem is this. For those who voted for the hardworking pre-industrial farmers, the point is the following. There are moments in the year in which you, as a farmer, have to work a lot during sunlight, the period of sunlight, however. You don't work at night in the fields. For example, harvest. There is a moment in the year when you have to collect your crops. If you don't, you starve during the winter. So you have to, of course, a strong motivation, right? If you don't want to starve, that's, kind of very strong motivation. But what do you do in the winter? As close to nothing as you can, because you are minimizing the consumption of calories. Because you know, intuitively, that if you work more, if you use more of your physical strength, you will become hungrier. You will need to eat more, but you are eating the reserves from the harvest. And you will have to wait for the new harvest before having extra additional food sources available. Okay? So in winter, you don't work, or you work extremely little. You maybe prepare new tools or repair the tools, but there are very few things that you do in a traditional farming society in the cold months of the year, when basically you don't have any activity to do, to accomplish in the countryside, right, in your fields. So it's absolutely clear that, unfortunately, there has never been any human society in history who worked as much as we do. My personal hope is that you will work more than me, because it's kind of schadenfreude and whatever. Jokes apart, that's the point. We can work at night, especially us, who probably will do an intellectual work. We can work at any moment in time. The work follows us. We go to holiday, we have our computer, and we work. We work on weekends, potentially, of course. These people, no, they have to do a huge amount of work in a relatively short period of time. They are totally committed to that. But in other periods of the year, they need to minimize the expenditure of calories. And they do that also by not doing useless physical activities, useless work. Right? So the problem is the following. There is a red line connecting the beginning of agriculture with our society, and it's a line along which human beings have worked more and more and more and more, and that's a pretty depressing, if you want, especially if you think about the fact that this is irreversible, because the only well, not technically irreversible, and I will explain why. But it's not a matter of choice, because you will not plan for your society to starve, right? You don't want to starve yourself. You don't want your children to starve. So if you can, you produce more food, then you end up having more children, surviving, by the way, and so forth and so forth and so on. Now, we have evidence. There is a famous economist who was very important in the debate about neo-Malthusians and non-neo-Malthusians back in the 1960s, 1970s, Esther Boserup. She was a Swedish economist who also got the Nobel Prize, if not wrong. And she kind of demonstrated that if you look at societies, you find a close correlation between density of population and intensity of agricultural techniques. And she also provides evidence that you move back and forth, because if you have population and then maybe a terrible plague comes and kills half the people, you have evidence that they move to less labor-intensive agrarian techniques, right? And then when population starts increasing again, they move up this ladder again. So the point is, in this context, when you categorize a certain agrarian system as more advanced, that categorization presents some areas, some gray areas, right? Because it's not always and intrinsically a matter of choice. The choice is you maximize the production, minimizing the effort. If you have few workers available, you can't use a too productive way of farming because you need a labor force, which you don't have, right? And so the first thing you do when population density drops is to reverting to less labor-intensive agrarian techniques, which we categorize as being less advanced because we have in mind a kind of artificial line of progress which moves from, past to future, and you have historically a general movement towards more and more labor-intensive and intensive ways of farming more generally, which, however, results from the progressive lack of options, of alternative options. Those systems of extremely labor-intensive cultivation are introduced because you need to feed more people. And we have other bits of evidence that this is a constraint. It's not a matter of choice. We know, again from archaeology, in this case from skeletal evidence, you look at the skeletons survived, or the population living in this period, we know that the prevalence of certain diseases increases a lot after the movement from hunter-gatherers to farmers and the establishment of the first permanent villages, including diseases which are connected to the quality of food. So the quality of food available to each individual, in fact, doesn't improve after the Neolithic Revolution and the introduction of agriculture. It doesn't. It worsens. Right? Because you maximize calories against variety. And by the way, I could make you more recent examples of this. It's exactly what happens in the northern Italy in the 16th century, for example. You have, in much of the area, the development of a model of farming based on the production of two things, which are wheat to make bread, and grapes to produce wine. And wine is crucial because wine is a very important provider of additional calories. So if you have to do hard work, you have to drink alcoholics in the context of a pre-industrial European farming society. Then it's wine in the south of Europe, it's beer or other stuff in the north of Europe, depending on, of course, what you can cultivate in different parts of the continent. Okay? And this is done sacrificing variety. So in the end, you eat less varied food, and eating less varied food has an impact on your health. And we have strong hints about this in the archaeology. Now, you might think that there is a logical issue here, because if you have health worsening after the introduction of agriculture, you might expect that the death rate increases. But if the death rate increases, you expect, of course, that the growth rate of the population declines. Now, the population equation in a closed population, so without immigration or emigration, if you think about the whole of the world, it's a closed population. So you can reduce these to two variables. So the natural growth rate, the so-called natural growth rate, is equal to the birth rate minus the death rate, with the birth rate being equal to the number of births over the population, and the death rates being equal to the number of deaths over population, of course. Very simple equation, right? If you have more people being born than people dying, this is going to be positive. And I told you, we know from archaeology that this increases significantly. We also have evidence from archaeology that this increases significantly, which might lead you to expect that this actually declines. The reason why it doesn't is that, apart from an increase in the death rate, so a worsening of the survival of human beings, you have big time an increase in the birth rate. So the introduction of agriculture has an impact both on mortality and on fertility. Why is that? Because if you are in a village, you can have the children roaming around the village without hopefully killing themselves or being eaten by wild animals. If you're a hunter-gatherer and you have to move all the time, somebody, usually the mother, has to carry the kid. And there is only so many kids you can actually carry physically, right? So you can have many more kids roaming around in a village. Additionally, in a population of farmers, you will have woman and wife, so husband and wife, say, living closer together for a longer part of the year, instead of having, the men moving to further distances to hunt and then being away from the couple, and this tends to lead to fewer children being born for practical reasons. So you have more children being born, you have children being easier to grow, children actually from a much younger age being able to provide help with an economic content. For a hunter-gatherer society, children are an issue because there isn't much that they can actually do. In a farming society, from very early on, they can start helping in the fields. So they become more economically useful. I could go on and on and on about this topic, which, as you might have understood, I like a lot. And I could give you more and more evidence for this, but we don't have the time. Right? But is this clear? So the point is, you can look at this as two alternative explanations. This is a traditional one. Now, I think the consensus is that this is much closer to the mark, because we have a growing amount of archaeological information which supports this view. And of course, when I say the health worsens and these people actually experience a growing death rate, there is also another way of dying which becomes much more common, which is what? So it's not only a matter of nutrition. What happens when you start having many people living close one to the other? Yeah, worse. But there are things more lethal than worse. Illness depends on which kind of illness. Somebody said plagues. Epidemics, not pandemics, because the definition of pandemics is an epidemic which spreads across the continent. So in this context, they are too isolated. Yeah, you have infectious diseases. You have the possibility that epidemics spread. It's not like nobody was dying of infectious diseases before. The point is, it's very difficult that you have an epidemic, because to have an epidemic, which is defined as the increase in a short period of time of the number of cases of a specific illness over the normal, you need to have a population dense enough to allow for that pathogen to spread. So yeah, you have plagues or whatever, not Yersinia pestis, which is the pathogen of the disease plague, because as far as we know, that appears in populations much later in the Neolithic Revolution. But in general, you have the first epidemics killing people, which of course also results into a demographic wave-like process, which of course will generate all the kind of impacts on cultivation techniques which I mentioned before, making the life of archaeologists more interesting also. Yes, so that's the origin of this. And again, we will go back to this topic later. This is, for example, one, the prevalence of pathogens which might lead to epidemics is one of the factors that presumably hindered the development of Africa in the long run of history. We'll talk more about that during the course. Now, to move on a bit, the important thing here is that this process happens across Eurasia as well as in other parts of the world. When you think about Eurasia, or in general the old world, so including Africa in this case, and the Americas, there is possibly a disadvantage in the Americas due to the moment when human beings arrived there and then into agriculture, and the relatively less favorable conditions regarding the availability of domesticable species of plants and animals. But there is another crucial, so in this story, however, arguably, there is not that much of a difference between Eurasia and Africa. And when I say Africa in this context, I mean sub-Saharan Africa, because Northern Africa, so the strip above the Sahara Desert, is basically part of the Mediterranean area from whatever variable or indicator you want to think about, right? So it's entirely in that area of circulation of people, crops, ideas, and whatever. Sub-Saharan Africa is a little bit different, but you could think that there you could have access to species domesticated elsewhere. So even if millet is worse than wheat, that doesn't matter that much, because at a certain point in time, at least on principle, you might bring the additional cereal there. But there is another moment in history when you have instead something happening in Africa which makes it stand apart, in this case from Eurasia, which is the so-called urban revolution. So you have agrarian revolution first, 12 to 10,000 years ago. Then you have the urban revolution of the Bronze Age, about 5,000 years ago. The urban revolution is the moment when the first cities start appearing. A city is something pretty different from a village. It's not only a matter of size. A city, an early city, can perform a number of functions which could not be performed in a village, for a number of reasons, one of which is the simple availability of human beings for producing, for dividing the activities between specialized tasks. Now, in general, the moment when you start having sedentary societies, so the moment when people start settling with the agrarian revolution, is also the moment when you have a slow process towards a greater diversification between the human activities that each individual member of society accomplishes, and also the moment when you start having probably an increase in inequality between human beings. Although for pre-historical societies, that's quite a bit of a more complex issue, but still, this stands, you also have a growing difference between human beings. And this becomes even more clear and a much stronger process with the emergence of the first cities. And the emergence of the first cities makes Eurasia, so again, both Europe and Asia, stand out compared to sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll go back to this soon enough. Now, I would like to at least so some of these things we already discussed. When we think, the very important thing is the following. When we think about long-run divergence between world areas, we have the possibility of looking at the Neolithic revolution and in general at agriculture and herding as the origin of divergence between the Americas and Eurasia. And here, of course, I mean between the native original populations of the Americas and the population of Eurasia, right? When we look instead at the urban revolution, we have the possibility of understanding why Africa did not follow along the same path as Eurasia. Because Africa does not experience all the constraints which maybe the Americas had experienced. Now, in which sense we can look at this kind of variables to find the origin of what we can call, or to find the causes of what we can call an early divergence between Eurasia and the rest? Because first, again, domesticable species were available not in a very uneven way between Eurasia and other world areas because of other geographical factors, which I would like to very quickly show you now, and then because of the timing of human colonization. I think next week, because I don't think we'll be able to cover also this, we will look that there is also something to say about institutions and culture here, which, however, become more important when you want to understand why Eurasia stands out compared to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we already mentioned the issue of the domesticable wild species. I already argued that the main crops available in America were inferior to those available in Eurasia. If you think about animals, so large domesticable animals, the difference is even starker because basically the only large animal which can be domesticated in the Americas, which is original from the Americas, is the llama. Instead, you have in Eurasia, you have the sheep, the cow, the horse, the buffalo, the camel. You have a lot. And the cow and the horse in particular are much stronger than the llama. So if you have to use them as beasts of burden, if you have to rely upon their physical strength, they are much stronger than whatever could be domesticated in the Americas. And this has consequences in the long run. So it seems quite clear that the difference was pretty stark, placing the Americas at a disadvantage. Sorry, okay. Now, this is the issue also with how, the other point is, nutrition is only part of the story. The other part of the story is how close were the wild species to the domesticated species, because this is an indicator of the time needed to domesticate them. Now, I mentioned the teosinte. The teosinte is this transplant to the left, which is probably the wild ancestor of maize. And the simple fact that we aren't sure whether maize comes from this plant or from some other means that, you know, the domesticated species is very different from its wild ancestor. And the teosinte had an extremely small fruit, as you can see. There is a coin which shows you the proportion between modern maize and the teosinte. And then the process leading from the wild to the domesticated plant was, again, proportionally more complex. So probably beyond having been settled later in time, beyond that, you also have a problem with how different are those species compared to the final domesticated species you want to get, or you will get at a certain point in time. Then there is an issue with, as I already mentioned, geography and climate. You remember the story I told you about how maize imported from the Americas to Europe spread from Galicia through North Spain, South France, North Italy, whatever, west to east. It was spreading west to east following, you know, an area with relatively similar climate. Now, the problem is climate tends to be similar along the west to east axis, while climate belts tend to change along the north-south axis, which means that if you have a landmass with a northwest orientation, Eurasia, compared to a landmass with north-south orientation, the Americas, you will have a greater facility of spreading domesticated variants of your plants because you move along similar climate belts. Instead, in the Americas, if you consider additionally the fact that human beings get into the Americas by crossing the Bering Strait during the last ice age, like both basically, so they enter the American continents from the northwest tip, and then they walk all the way down to the south, and it takes them 2,000 years, by the way, to reach from the northwest Patagonia in the south, to the southernmost tip of South America, 2,000 years, right, to do that. And part of the reason why it takes that much is that they always have to change climate belt as they move from north to south, because the orientation is clear. The other problem is, geographical problem, is that there is the Isthmus of Panama. So there is a point where the land becomes, the strip of land between the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean becomes very narrow. And that also might have slowed down the spread of human beings across the continent. And these are purely geographical factors, right? You see here clearly the climate belts, sorry, the geographic orientation. Africa also has this issue, another issue which Africa suffers from, apart from the Suez area, where again you have a narrow strip of land, is the Sahara Desert, which makes it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to move from the north of Africa or the Middle East to sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the climate belts, you see this again clearly. If you think about what it means to move from northwest of America to Patagonia, you see easily that you have a continuous changing climate belt. And this is from Diamond. And here you have the timing of human colonization, which again shows you clearly that human beings arrive in North America from the Bering Strait relatively late, about 12,000 years before the current era, with some uncertainty, and then it takes another 2,000 years for them to reach the bottom of South America. Okay, and I think that next week we will cover another important variable, which is institutions and culture, which, as we will see next week, distinguish Eurasia from the rest, in this case, including Africa, according to another scholar, which is Jack Goody. So much of what I told you today, you will also find in Diamond. But Diamond doesn't provide us with an explanation about the possible early origin of divergences between Eurasia and Africa. It's very useful for understanding why the Americas had a disadvantage. So when the Europeans arrived, they were structurally placed at disadvantage because they had started the societies later, they had encountered less favorable conditions because of geography and availability of wild species, and so forth and so on. It's like they were on a time lag compared to the development of the Eurasian societies. And this was a disadvantage, right, at the moment when they get in touch with people from Western Europe in this case. And this means also that they were relatively easily taken over by these definitely quite ruthless Europeans, right? But Diamond doesn't provide us with any explanation about why Africa doesn't follow the same path as Eurasia. Of course, again, millet is not wheat, it's not rice, but that doesn't seem to be sufficient. It's much more interesting to see what Goody argues, and Goody will focus on institutions and culture. Interestingly, however, he focuses on what is common across Eurasia. You might be used to studies, for example, in economics, which tend to argue that there are all these differences between institutions and culture within areas of the West. The point that Goody makes is that if you look at certain key institutions, like, for example, marriage, private property, inheritance, and all these are still connected. Private property, in the kind of time frame we think about, is a variable which is an institution which is strictly connected to the kind of marriage system which we find across Eurasia, with variants. But the point is, there is something which is very similar at the core of these institutions, according to Goody, which I personally think is right, but according to this interpretation, with which you might disagree, there is something which is extremely similar across Eurasia, but is different in sub-Saharan Africa. And the moment when this area starts to differ, looking at institutions and culture, is the urban revolution of the Bronze Age. We are slightly late, so we have maybe time for taking one question, if there is one. Next week, we'll begin exactly with these points. So I'm sure that, this institutional discourse will become clearer by next week. Yes? Could you please speak louder? The readings, you mean? No, so I specify lecture by lecture the teaching material which is supporting to the specific lecture. I don't require you to read anything in advance, basically. The important thing is that you are aware that at a certain date you will have the midterm exam, so of course you will have to cover by that. But you can absolutely feel free, and I'm not requiring you to read anything before the actual lecture. And remember that together with some lectures, I will upload additional material, and all the material which is uploaded in the Blackboard space is going to be compulsory reading for the exam, unless specified otherwise. But this will be very clear, because at the end of the first part of the course, I will also upload a list of each chapter and other readings that you have to cover. Yes? The videos, yes, as I said, they are also part of the material for the exam, because at least some, so the video which I couldn't show you today is about the Neolithic Revolution and the urban revolution. It adds content about the domestication of animals. There is this interesting story about how you move from the auroch to a cow, which you can also see kind of graphically in the video. In other cases, we add additional bits. For example, there will be one about the Portuguese in Japan. There will be one about the Genoese and their connection with the Spanish crown in the perspective of the open Atlantic trade routes and whatever. So these are things which will not cover that much in class for reasons of time, but they are also part of the program. And the reason why I can show them in class is that I couldn't find a way to make the students at home hear the audio. So I'm sorry, let's go for the simplest thing, and you look at them on your own, okay? Which is a shame. There was a lot of work which went into kind of producing those videos. Okay, so see you next week. We have 2 classes on Tuesday, I think, yes.